It all started quietly, which somehow made it worse. There was no dramatic blow-up, no final argument about money or ownership. The relationship ended the way a lot of them do, drifting apart, vague promises to stay respectful, and an unspoken assumption that what we had built together would remain exactly that. Shared history, not stolen property. The business idea had been mine from the beginning. I'd spent months refining it late nights, sketching workflows, researching competitors, testing pricing models, even drafting pitch decks that never left my laptop. At the time, I trusted my ex completely. They had access to everything: documents, notes, strategy files, even early branding concepts. I never imagined I'd need to protect myself from the person sitting across the table, nodding along as I talked about the future. After the breakup, I stepped back. I needed space, not just emotionally, but creatively. I told myself I'd revisit the idea when things settled. That pause turned out to be the opening they needed. A few weeks later, I saw it by accident. A post shared by a mutual acquaintance. A new venture, same industry, same target market, same problem being solved in almost the same language I'd written months earlier. I clicked through, telling myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't. The structure was identical. The value proposition was nearly word for word. Even the tone felt familiar. It wasn't inspired by my idea. It was my idea, stripped of context and rushed into the world without me. What hit harder than the theft itself was how confident it all looked. Like they'd always owned it, like I'd never existed. Then came the part I didn't see coming. Within days of the launch, HOA Karenauer H.O., a board president, the loudest voice in every meeting, publicly praised the business in the community newsletter. She called it innovative, forward-thinking, and a great example of entrepreneurship in our neighborhood. She even encouraged residents to support it. That alone would have been frustrating, but it didn't stop there. Less than a week later, I received an official HOA violation notice. It claimed I was operating an unauthorized business from my home. It cited vague bylaw sections about commercial activity, warned of escalating fines, and demanded immediate compliance. The irony was staggering. I hadn't launched anything. I hadn't advertised. I hadn't sold a single product. But my ex had. Same neighborhood, same setup, same visible footprint. I emailed the HOA, calmly asking for clarification. I explained that I wasn't operating a business at all, and asked how enforcement was being determined. The response came from Karen herself, short, dismissive, final. She said enforcement decisions were at the board's discretion and suggested I focus on compliance instead of comparison. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the identical situation next door. Just authority, exercised without justification. That's when the emotional part really hit. Not just betrayal, but erasure. Watching someone take your work is bad enough. Watching an authority figure legitimize it and then punish you for existing in the same space does something deeper. It makes you question whether playing fair ever mattered in the first place. For a brief moment, I considered calling my ex out publicly. I drafted messages I never sent. I imagined walking into the next HOA meeting and laying everything out in front of everyone. But experience had taught me something important. People like this don't lose power when you get loud. They lose it when you get precise. So I went quiet. No public posts. No arguments. No emotional emails. I archived the violation notice, saved every message, and started documenting everything. Dates, times, statements. Who said what and when. If HOA Karen wanted rules, I would read every single one. If my ex wanted credit, I would let them keep it for now. Because at that moment I realized something critical. They hadn't stolen the hard part. They'd taken the surface-level idea and rushed it out under protection they assumed would last forever. Meanwhile, I still had the deeper understanding, the execution plan, the patience. And patience, I decided, was going to be my advantage. By the end of that week, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I pulled out a fresh notebook, wrote one sentence at the top of the page, and underlined it twice. If they copied the idea, I'll build the version they can't. That was the moment everything shifted. And that was when the real work began. I didn't start by building anything. That would have been a mistake. The first step wasn't action, it was observation. If I was going to do this right, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against, without emotion clouding the process. So I studied what my ex had launched, as if I were a competitor who had just entered the market. I signed up anonymously. I followed their updates. I read the reviews, the comments, the complaints people didn't think anyone was paying attention to. On the surface, it looked polished, confident, successful. But once you spent time inside it, the cracks started showing. The experience felt rushed. Features were half-finished. Support responses were slow and inconsistent. Promises were made that clearly couldn't scale. It was obvious they had copied the framework but skipped the refinement. They had sprinted to be first, not better. That distinction mattered more than I expected. At the same time, I turned my attention to the HOA. If Karen was going to insert herself into this, I needed to understand exactly what authority she actually had, not what she claimed to have, not what people assumed she had, what the bylaws, policies, and state laws actually said. I pulled every governing document I could find, covenants, enforcement procedures, amendment histories, meeting minutes going back years. It wasn't glamorous work, but patterns emerged quickly. Rules were applied selectively. Warnings were inconsistent. Enforcement timelines were ignored whenever it was convenient. Most importantly, I noticed something Karen seemed to rely on heavily: ambiguity, broad language. Vague phrases like "at the board's discretion" and "commercial activity" used as blunt instruments rather than defined standards. That kind of authority only works as long as no one challenges it with specifics. I compared my situation to my ex's. Same neighborhood, same visibility, same alleged commercial activity, yet only one of us received a violation notice. The more I lined things up side by side, the clearer it became this wasn't enforcement. It was favoritism. That realization did something unexpected. It took away the feeling of being powerless. Because favoritism leaves a trail, and trails can be documented. I started building a file, screenshots of HOA praise for my ex's business, copies of my violation notice, dates showing overlap between their launch and my warning. Every piece went into a folder labeled simply Timeline. Once I had that, I went back to the business idea itself, not the stolen version, the original. I laid out everything I had envisioned before the breakup, then asked a hard question. What did they miss? The answer was depth. They had taken the headline, not the substance. They hadn't understood why certain decisions were made or how the concept was meant to evolve. They'd built something that looked complete, but couldn't grow without breaking. That's when I saw my real advantage. I wasn't behind, I was unburdened. I could rebuild without shortcuts, without trying to justify rushed decisions, without the pressure of pretending I'd invented something overnight. I rewrote the plan from scratch. Same core problem, but approached differently. Systems instead of patches. Scalability instead of spectacle. Features that solved frustrations I'd already seen users complaining about in my ex's version. And I made one rule for myself. Nothing would move forward unless it was clearly better, not just different. Meanwhile, Corinne sent another email, a reminder about pending compliance. Still no explanation. Still no acknowledgement of the double standard. I didn't reply. That silence wasn't avoidance, it was leverage. Every unanswered message became another data point. Every assumption she made without evidence worked in my favor. By the end of the assessment phase, the picture was clear. My ex had speed, visibility, and protection they didn't understand. Corinne had confidence, volume, and procedural blind spots. And I had something neither of them realized, yet a complete understanding of their weaknesses. I closed my laptop that night knowing exactly what came next. No public response. No confrontation. No announcements. Just quiet execution. The kind that only becomes visible when it's already too late to stop. Once the assessment was done, everything else became quiet. That was intentional. The loudest mistake people make after being wronged is announcing their comeback before it exists. I wasn't interested in motivation speeches or public declarations. I wanted results that spoke for themselves. So I disappeared. Not literally, but socially. I stopped engaging in community threads. I muted HOA emails except for documentation. I let people assume I'd backed down. That assumption turned out to be one of my greatest assets. Behind the scenes, I started rebuilding the business the way it should have been built the first time. Not fast, not flashy. Correct. Instead of layering features on top of a weak foundation, I restructured the system entirely. Processes replaced workarounds. Automation replaced manual fixes. Every decision was tested against one question. Could this scale without breaking? I didn't talk about it with anyone who didn't need to know. The fewer people involved, the less there was to leak. The irony wasn't lost on me. This time, secrecy wasn't paranoia. It was discipline. I also reached out to partners I trusted, but carefully. No names, no timelines, just capability checks. Quiet conversations about integration, logistics, and long-term collaboration. What I found was encouraging. When you approach people with clarity instead of hype, they listen differently. Several of them had already seen my ex's product. Some had even been pitched. And without me prompting them, they mentioned the same issues I documented. Overpromising, under-delivering, a lack of long-term planning. That confirmation mattered. It told me I wasn't rebuilding in a vacuum. While all of this was happening, HOA Karen stayed busy. Notices continued. Deadlines were reiterated. Warnings were phrased more sternly, but still no action. Just pressure. I let it sit. Every email she sent without proper procedure added weight to my position. I saved them, labeled them, and moved on. The goal wasn't to win an argument. It was to let the system expose itself. By the time I had a working prototype, something unexpected happened. I felt calm, not angry, not rushed. Calm. That's how I knew the strategy was working. The prototype wasn't just better, it was quieter, faster, more intuitive. It solved the problems people didn't know how to articulate yet. I ran private tests with a handful of users who had tried my XS version and left disappointed. I didn't explain the backstory. I didn't ask leading questions. If something didn't serve the core, it didn't make the cut. Meanwhile, cracks were starting to show publicly on the other side. Complaints were getting louder. Marketing efforts became more aggressive. Discounts appeared where confidence used to be. The pace told the story better than any announcement could. They were reacting. I wasn't. The final step of the underdog playbook wasn't technical. It was legal. This time, every protection was in place. Ownership clarified. Branding secured. Processes documented. There would be no confusion about what belonged to whom. By the end of that phase, I had something solid, something defensible, something that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. And for the first time since the betrayal, I smiled, not because revenge was coming, but because success no longer depended on outshouting anyone. It depended on execution. And that part was already done. By the time everything on my side was locked in, the outside world still thought nothing had changed. That was exactly how I wanted it. Momentum is most powerful when it's invisible. I stayed quiet and watched. From a distance, my ex's business still looked active, but the energy had shifted. The early confidence was gone. Updates felt reactive instead of intentional. Promotions became louder, more frequent, almost desperate. Every time they announced something new, it felt like a patch rather than progress. Customers noticed. You could hear it in the tone of the feedback. Confusion, frustration, repeated complaints about the same unresolved issues. The kind of problems that don't disappear no matter how much money you throw at marketing. Meanwhile, HOA Corinne was growing restless. Her emails started changing. Less certainty, more repetition. She referenced ongoing concerns without naming them. She reminded me of deadlines that had already passed without consequence. It was clear she expected resistance, maybe even a confrontation. I gave her neither. Silence unsettles people who rely on authority. Without pushback, they don't know which lever to pull. And every time she reached out without following proper procedure, she weakened her own position. On my end, I focused on polish. Branding wasn't just about looking different. It was about signaling competence. Everything from the language to the visual identity communicated clarity and confidence. No exaggeration, no buzzwords. Just precision. I finalized the messaging and tested it quietly. No ads, no announcements. Just controlled exposure to people who understood the market. The response was consistent. They didn't ask many questions. They didn't need convincing. They recognized the difference immediately. That was when I knew the timing mattered. A comeback too early looks emotional. A comeback too late looks reactive. I needed the moment where contrast would do the work for me. That moment arrived when my ex's business announced a major update, and it failed. Not catastrophically. Not publicly. Just enough to frustrate users and force an apology. The rollout was rushed, the communication unclear, and the fix took longer than promised. I watched the response carefully. Engagement dropped. Comments slowed. The noise faded. That night I scheduled everything on my end. Launch assets, press materials, partner announcements. Nothing went live. It was all queued, waiting for a single decision. Before pulling the trigger, I double-checked one last thing. Protection. Every legal detail was finalized. Ownership clarified. Compliance confirmed. There would be no room for ambiguity, no opportunity for selective enforcement. If anyone tried to challenge it, Karen included, the answer would already be documented. I thought about how different this felt from the first time. Back then, I had been eager, trusting, open. This time I was calm, prepared, grounded. There was no rush, no adrenaline, just certainty. The night before launch, I didn't sleep much, not because I was anxious, but because my mind kept replaying how this would unfold. Not the confrontation, not the reactions, just the quiet realization people would have when they saw what had been built. That realization was the real impact. I didn't announce the launch in advance. No countdowns, no teasers, no warnings. If you need attention before you exist, you probably don't exist yet. Instead, I waited until morning, reviewed everything one last time, and hovered over the final confirmation. At that point, the outcome no longer felt like revenge. It felt like inevitability. I pressed publish, and then I closed my laptop. Because from that moment on, the story was no longer about what I planned to do. It was about how everyone else would react when they realized what had just happened. I didn't watch the launch in real time. That might sound strange, but I already knew what I needed to know. The work was finished. Whatever happened next would happen whether I stared at the screen or not. It wasn't long before my phone started lighting up. At first it was subtle. A message from one of the partners I'd quietly looped in weeks earlier. Then another, and another. Short notes, screenshots, one-word reactions that said more than paragraphs ever could. People were noticing. The response wasn't loud in the beginning, it was fast. Users who had struggled with my ex's platform recognized the difference immediately. They didn't need explanations or comparisons. They could feel it in the experience. Things worked the way they expected them to work. Questions they'd had for months simply didn't come up anymore. That kind of reaction spreads quickly. By midday, traffic was climbing steadily, not spiking wildly, but growing in a way that felt sustainable. Engagement was deeper. People stayed longer. They explored instead of bouncing. Those metrics mattered more to me than vanity numbers ever had. Then the comparison started without me saying a word. Comments appeared across forums and social spaces, not naming names but clearly drawing lines. This is how it should have been done. Finally, someone who understands the problem. Switching over today, I didn't respond, I didn't share, I didn't correct anyone. The contrast spoke for itself. Meanwhile, my ex noticed. You could see it in the timing of their updates. A sudden announcement, a rushed feature release. Messaging that felt defensive instead of confident. They were reacting to something they hadn't anticipated, competition that didn't ask for permission or validation. And then there was Karen. The HOA email came late that afternoon. Not aggressive this time, careful, measured. She asked for clarification about what I had launched and whether it constituted commercial activity. No threats. No deadlines. Just questions. That shift told me everything. I responded politely, attaching documentation I'd already prepared. Compliance confirmations, definitions, clear explanations supported by the HOA's own bylaws and state regulations. No commentary, no emotion, just facts. Hours later, another email arrived. This one wasn't from Corinne. It was from the HOA's legal counsel. They thanked me for the clarification and confirmed that no violation existed. No apology. No explanation. Just confirmation. That was the moment I allowed myself to sit back. The launch continued to gain traction over the next few days. Partners amplified it organically. People shared it not because they were told to, but because it solved a problem they were tired of dealing with. That kind of growth doesn't feel explosive, it feels inevitable. My ex tried to regain control of the narrative. A post here, a subtle jab there, but it didn't land. When your product struggles, no amount of framing can save it. What surprised me most wasn't the success itself. It was how little I felt the need to acknowledge the past. The theft stopped mattering once the outcome became clear. Whatever credit they thought they'd secured dissolved in comparison. The numbers told a simple story. Retention was higher. Support requests were lower. Growth was steady. And unlike before, nothing felt fragile. Curran went quiet. The newsletter praise never came back. The warnings stopped. Enforcement shifted elsewhere. It was as if the issue had never existed, except this time I had the documentation to prove it had. I realized then that the real shock wasn't the launch. It was the silence that followed. No confrontation. No public reckoning. Just a quiet rebalancing of power that left the people who had been so confident scrambling to adjust. By the end of the week, I understood something clearly. This wasn't revenge. It was replacement. And replacement is always louder than retaliation, especially when you don't announce it. Once the dust settled, the loudest part of the story became what didn't happen. There was no dramatic apology, no public admission of wrongdoing, no moment where anyone stood up and confessed to having crossed a line. Instead, things simply changed. And that change was more telling than any confrontation could have been. The HOA adjusted its tone first. Communications became carefully worded. Enforcement notices suddenly included citations, definitions, and timelines that hadn't existed before. Policies that had once been interpreted loosely were now referenced precisely. It was clear that someone had advised them to stop improvising. Corinne, in particular, became noticeably quieter. She still attended meetings, still held her position, but the confidence was gone. The kind of confidence that comes from assuming no one will ever push back. When she spoke, it was with caution. When questions were raised, she deferred instead of declaring. Authority doesn't vanish all at once. It retreats when exposed. Neighbors noticed. A few people reached out privately, not to congratulate me, but to ask how I'd navigated the situation. They'd had their own run-ins, fines that didn't make sense, warnings that felt arbitrary. For the first time, they were seeing proof that the system wasn't as untouchable as it appeared. I shared what mattered and kept the rest to myself. Documentation, patience, precision. That was the formula, not outrage, not public fights, just knowing when to speak and when to wait. As for my ex, the distance grew quietly. Their business didn't collapse overnight. It didn't need to. Momentum slowed, engagement flattened. The urgency in their messaging never fully disappeared. When you build something without understanding it, you spend the rest of your time reacting to problems you didn't anticipate. I stopped checking entirely. That, more than anything, told me I'd moved on. The success I'd rebuilt felt different, lighter. It didn't depend on comparisons or validation. It stood on its own merits. Systems worked. Feedback loops improved the product instead of exposing its weaknesses. Growth felt intentional instead of frantic. One afternoon, I walked past the same spot where I'd first read the violation notice months earlier. I remembered the tightness in my chest, the disbelief, the feeling that something deeply unfair was happening, and there was nothing I could do about it. The contrast was almost surreal. Nothing external had changed dramatically. The neighborhood looked the same, the HOA still existed. My ex was still around somewhere, but the power dynamic was completely different. Not because anyone gave it back to me, but because I'd taken responsibility for understanding it. That was the real vindication. Not the launch, not the numbers. Not even the quiet acknowledgement from the HOA's attorney. It was the realization that being underestimated had never been a disadvantage. It had been camouflage. The people who assumed I'd fold had stopped watching, and by the time they noticed again, the outcome was already settled. If there's one lesson I carried forward, it's this. Ideas are easy to copy. Authority is easy to abuse. But execution, calm, deliberate, and informed, has a way of outlasting both. I didn't need revenge. I needed distance, discipline, and time. And in the end, the thing that shocked everyone wasn't that I came back stronger. It was that I never needed to announce it at all.